almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being videoed.
She's like, I want to be on video.
Woo,
All right, let's go. Let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that.
Hello, Internet. I'm Brett. This is my show. I do live weekly Ask Me Anythings about every week, pretty consistently. So if this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been around a while, you know the format. This is sort of a little bit of a show at the beginning where I talk about some news, projects, things I'm working on, and then we get to your questions. So if you're in the chat, you're hopefully asking your questions and I will answer them in order. We get through as much as we can in an hour to an hour and a half at the most, and really I try to stick it to be as close as possible to an hour. So if I don't get to your questions at the end, don't worry. Just leave the browser open and I will answer your questions in chat even after I stop recording. This is actually a recorded show, so even if you don't get to watch this live, it can, or you don't get to finish it, right? It gets to be put on the my channel on YouTube. That's what you're looking at now. So the first thing I want you to do is, if you like this topic, DevOps, Docker, all those things, make sure you subscribe and click the bell, and the bell will notify you after you subscribed. It will notify you like on your mobile or whatever, whenever I go live. So it's usually on Thursdays, but not always. Sometimes we do bonus rounds. And I also have other links you can see in the URL that I've got down below at brettfisher.com/Docker. That link will get you to a whole lot of stuff, a lot of my free resources, my courses that I sell, and other places that I might do stuff like this. I now Twitch a little bit. If you have ever been on that platform and like Twitch, I do more of a casual working on my projects sort of style on Twitch, and here on YouTube is where it's more organized, more short content, not multi-hours of me working on a project. So I use both of those. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, which one you like more, which one you'd like to see more of, more YouTube or more Twitch or which one do you prefer? You know, which do you like? Because I'm often trying to figure out where we all hang out, and I'm going to be there. So first, I want to talk about some things. I'm working in the middle of my Docker for Node.js course. We are finishing that up. The last few sections we're actually recording this week, and you can get on that alert list by signing up for the newsletter, and I'll put a link here in the chat. That's at brettfisher.com/newsletter. Now, it's not a weekly newsletter yet. I wish it was, but I just don't have time to send out all this stuff weekly. So what I do is that newsletter goes out about once a month, and it's stuff that I'm working on, stuff that I think is really important for us to all be aware of, maybe some new content that's been created that's pretty good. Obviously, there's lots of places on the internet where you can find new blog articles and stuff. So I try to keep that to a minimum and focus more on courses that I'm doing, big projects, stuff that maybe I'm working on with the Docker captains, where we're the community of volunteers that help lead the community of Docker fans and stuff like that. And you can get all that over here on my webpage. Let me just switch the screen a little bit over to my browser. Okay, so over here in brettfisher.com/Docker, I mentioned I've got a lot of stuff there, and you can just click on that link there if you want to get notified of the Node.js. Just jump on my newsletter there, and then you can get notified of that course. I'm actually amazed at how much I'm putting into here, just because when I first started the idea of Docker and Node.js projects, which is one of my favorite languages and frameworks, really, JavaScript and Node.js, I thought of a couple of hours maybe of videos, but the more I keep focusing on Node.js projects, the more I realize there's a lot of stuff to it. So it keeps growing and growing. Right now, for instance, I'm working on how to use the latest features, which include build kit and multi-stage Docker images, to make the most flexible and smallest images that you can get for both development and production. Sometimes those are different. So how to use sort of one base image and then also get your dev tools in one, but also have just the production stuff you want for the production image, but keep it the same core image so that you don't end up with what we call config drift, which is where your development image is different than your production image, and then you actually have problems in production that you didn't test for properly because it was different in production. That was one of the reasons Docker was created. So to reduce the number of configurations. In fact, if you ever go back and listen to Solomon Hayek's original Docker pitch, that first 6 months that they were releasing the project 6 years ago, he often talks about that the reason that Docker and containers was so important and the problem they were trying to solve was the sheer amount of configuration drift between all the environments we have to develop and run apps in. You know, you got your test and your staging and your production and your beta and all these other different types of environments. And then you have local development on Windows versus Mac, and that's different. So that was one of their core goals. And I think now that we finally have multi-stage and build kit support in Docker, we're getting even closer to that true consistent image quality of going production. So anyway, check out that. We're probably more than a few weeks away, but not months away from releasing that course. And then after that, I'll be working on Kubernetes. So expect to hear more about that in the coming months. All right, so something I wanted to talk about this week, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments, whether or not you're doing it or you're concerned about it, is some great stuff the Docker captains were talking about in our Slack chat a couple of weeks ago. I think it might even have been last week or the week before, but it was more about some articles that came out, one specifically a couple of months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, around container security scanning. And what that really means is your images that you're doing inside of Docker that are the building blocks for your containers. Those are storage for your app as the dependencies as well. So the nice thing about that image is that it now becomes a really great place to scan for known vulnerabilities or potential security flaws in code and in applications and dependencies. So we call that container scanning or image scanning. There's different sort of terminology in the industry. But there's lots of scanners out there, and there's more than a few, and those all have pros and cons. And if this sounds familiar, this is very similar to the old antivirus wars where we had different antivirus scanners that would pick up on different things. But nowadays, with container scanning, the one that we typically talk about first is using the open database of known, that's the key word there, is known vulnerabilities in open source software, primarily open source software, but it's not exclusive to open source. It just happens to be mostly open source because that's where we tend to find a lot of the flaws because we can see the source. So we end up as an industry figuring out where the problems are quicker. So that stuff has a database of known vulnerabilities. It's updated all the time. And so there's scanners out there, some free, some not, that will scan your image and its dependencies. So not just your app, but also any apt-get dependencies that are installed, things like OpenSSL or even curl, if there's a vulnerability in that, and you have that in your container image. These scanners are supposed to help you find those vulnerabilities so that you can update them and hopefully apply a fix. And some interesting conversation came out about an article from this guy, Steven, and it was around that these scanners all have different pros and cons, right? Some detect problems, some detect other problems, and they maybe don't all detect the same thing. But at the end of the day, one of the things in Linux they really depend on is the operating system, or in this case, the base image, like Ubuntu, Debian, CentOS, Alpine, stuff like that. Those different base images often need to translate where the files are on the system and what program those files relate to, maybe like the open source OpenSSL libraries for providing SSL to your web servers. So those files exist on the operating system somewhere in a file path, and they all come together in a package, and those vendors need to supply the scanners essentially a translation to figure out for the scanners to find where the packages live. Okay, so that's the background. And it turns out that not all operating system distributions of Linux provide that functionality, and they don't all provide it as well as others. So this can cause problems if you're going to scan for vulnerabilities. In other words, your base image, whether it's Ubuntu or CentOS or Red Hat or Alpine, that now matters in terms of you being able to scan the complete database of known vulnerabilities in that image, all right? And one interesting point that I think came through this article, and by the way, I'll throw this article in the live chat so you can check that out. An interesting point that was made is that right now, as it is, down here at the bottom, he talks about the Alpine problem, which I think is a pretty interesting discussion around we as container makers, you're maybe someone who makes containers or at least is interested in making containers. And if you make those images, one of your concerns, right, is security. And security often has, we try to lump everything into it is secure or we have done security. And that's really not a thing, right? If you've been here long enough, you know that security is a lot of things. And there is no such thing as truly secure, right? We always joke that the most secure system is one that's turned off. So when you're talking about your software, there's lots of things to consider. And Alpine is a really great distribution and that provides a base image. Alpine Linux. Yeah. And one of the best parts about it is that it's very, very minimal. It's very small. Comes in at around 5 meg, which is crazy small compared to something like Ubuntu or CentOS. Now, you can compare that in the full operating system sense, but we're really just talking here about the images themselves, the container images, not your host OS. I don't want to talk about host OSs. I really want to just talk about your base images for your containers. Because what I see in the industry, and we love to talk about this online, is what's the cool, trendy thing that the zeitgeist of our community has sort of caught on to. And I think in the last couple of years, Alpine has risen in popularity, a lot to do with the fact that it has such a small image for containers. So that's a good thing. And if you I haven't even done this, but if I Googled, secure Docker base image, if you start looking around there, if I just search for the word Alpine, oh, it's not showing up on this page. So that was a Google fail. But what I would expect to see is people talking about Alpine because a lot of the industry likes to recommend Alpine as a way to get automatic security or better security out of the box. And the reason that we're arguing for that is that it's small. So if it's smaller, that means less files, less potential vulnerabilities, less things to potentially patch, right? And this has been something we've been doing for decades. Back in the Windows 2000 era, 2008, I remember when Windows 2008 came out, Microsoft had a new version called Core that was a smaller version of Windows Server. And at the time, one of their biggest arguments was better security through less patching. And so in theory, if you have less software on the machine, then there's less to worry about in terms of patching and potential vulnerabilities. So that's, in Alpine's case, that's one of their reasons for arguing that they're more secure. But space isn't always the number one factor. In fact, as an operator, as someone who runs servers for a living, disk space is cheap. 100 meg of disk space, even if it's times 5 images, is fine to me. I don't need to save 500 megs of space on my servers. Typically, I'm not backing up full operating systems. You're usually focused on application backups most of the time, especially now in the cloud where we're not doing image-based server backups, if that was something that you were ever into back in the old days. We had to do full image backups, and so a lot of our backups were just the entire operating system over and over again. Well, we don't do that so much, I think, as an industry, especially cloud native nowadays. And I think that when we talk about images and size is not even one of my top 3 factors, really, in terms of an image and its quality. So when I look at an image and potential security concerns or whatever, or just using of an image, whether or not it's a gig or 20 meg, at the end of the day, I'm not so concerned. I just need to plan for that because ultimately it maybe is a cost in storage, but that cost is one of the cheapest things on my list of costs, right? Humans being the most expensive thing, and then other things like computing power in terms of CPU, memory, networking, those are always, to me, more expensive than disk. So I don't tend to recommend to people to do Alpine out of the gate. In fact, if you've ever seen me talk about Docker production, you know that one of the things I talk about is sticking with what you know. Stick with Debian, stick with Ubuntu, stick with CentOS. Stay with those images if that's what you're used to, because Alpine is a lot different. It's got a different package manager. It's got different file locations. So you're going to have to end up changing a lot of your app just to use Alpine, and in most cases. Now, some cases, if you're using Go or maybe Node.js or something, you probably don't have to change a lot. But even recently, I have seen in just the last year, and especially in the last 3 months, I've seen multiple other indicators for why maybe you shouldn't be using Alpine as your base image. And this really isn't about throwing shade at Alpine and saying that Alpine's bad. It's really about, do we really need to do the extra work of implementing Alpine just for the sake of more security and smaller images? So my argument is going to be, I don't think that's even necessary. And if we consider this new sort of discussion around the Alpine problem in this blog article, is to say that Alpine right now maybe isn't the best place because it's really hard, if not impossible, to scan for security vulnerabilities in the CVE known database, the database of common vulnerabilities, that you can't actually do that yet with Alpine. And you can do that with some other ones, Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, stuff like that. So if you're someone who's going to use a security scanner, Alpine is actually a bad thing for you. Another thing I've noticed recently is that Alpine sometimes has sneaky problems that sneak up on you and in ways you wouldn't expect. I recently had some students tell me that trying to get Alpine working with NodeMon has known problems, and I'm not aware of this. I didn't test it, but people have come back to me and said using Alpine with their Node.js NodeMon, and NodeMon is something in Node.js is for file monitoring to automatically restart your Node app whenever files change. And that's really good for development. But evidently, they've had problems with Alpine when they wouldn't have had problems with Ubuntu and Debian. And I'm only bringing this up because it's an important factor to consider when you're going to go and implement a new base image. So a lot of people come to me and say, what do you think of Alpine? Should I switch everything to Alpine? Should I take all of my images that I'm building on Debian or Ubuntu or CentOS or something else, and should I shift all of those to go to Alpine because I hear it's smaller and more secure? And my answer, honestly, nowadays is it's more complicated than that, and you probably should consider it, but also maybe just not. Like, stick with what you're good at and what you know. The scanners work with yours, probably. You can use the default images because all official images that are default from Docker, such as, let's just go look at the node one. So the node default images all default to using Debian underneath, which is larger, slightly larger, maybe 80 meg larger than the Alpine image. But 80 meg, I mean, that's just a small factor that it's not, to me, a big motivator unless I'm maybe on some sort of, IoT device, maybe something like that, on the edge or something where I have really small flash drives or something. That might be a concern. But if you go look at the default images, if you didn't realize this in the background, all these default images are, if you just type Docker run node or Docker run MySQL, those are all going to run on Debian by default because that's how Docker was building them to begin with 6 years ago. But all of these now have Alpine options. So you would maybe say MySQL : Alpine and use the tag for Alpine. And that's fine, but it doesn't mean that you automatically get a better experience all the time, right? Not all packages are even available in the Alpine package manager. In fact, for my own use, I have to keep security tools or different utilities that I have. Some of them work in Alpine and some just don't. And I quite frankly don't want to go and manually figure out how to build them because they fail to build, and I just don't want to troubleshoot that because of different libraries. So I just leave a Debian for some of my tools, and I use other ones through Alpine. And at the end of the day, I know that almost everything is going to work on Debian out of the box because the apt-get package manager or apt package manager is sort of like the king of package managers. Everything there, if there's a package for something, it's probably going to be an apt, right? You might not see something in Yum, you might not see it in Alpine's package manager, but it's always going to be an apt. And apt comes with Debian and Ubuntu, and there are other variants of those base images. So when you're thinking about images, and to sum all this up, when you're thinking about images and you're wanting to build your base images, security is definitely a factor, but one of those, if you're really concerned about security, is you're going to want to scan your images. So if you're going to want to do that, Alpine may be a disadvantage for you in that case. So definitely read this article since I threw it up in the text there. Another thing is, does the space benefit really matter to you? If you're losing a little bit on potential security and your image size doesn't matter as much, especially if you're someone who has, 800 or 900 meg images, which are common when you're dealing with things like, Java or PHP, stuff like that. Those are commonly very large images comparative to 80 meg or 5 meg. So think about that stuff a little bit. Don't just automatically switch all your stuff because you heard Alpine was more secure. Obviously, there's lots of other security advantages to Alpine. Since it is small, it does have very few potential vulnerabilities in it, but it does have vulnerabilities, right? It's not impervious to software vulnerabilities. It's just maybe less so than Ubuntu and Debian. The last thing I'll say on this is if you have not looked at the other from images, such as Ubuntu and Debian, those images are getting smaller over time. And I'll just show you, for example, this is actually a little pet peeve of mine because things are getting pulled out of these images in new versions that used to be in old images. And that can actually cause problems with your software. For example, ping or ipconfig or maybe even the ps command, things that were maybe in the image years ago that you were used to are maybe no longer in those default images on current versions, and that can be a little bit of a problem if you assumed that they would always be there. So nowadays, I've gotten in the habit of, even if I'm using a Ubuntu image out of the box maybe, or I'm using the default images which use a Debian, I will also go through doing an apt-get install of even things like, the ps command for process listing or curl or whatever I might need, right? Ping or something. And that's just to make sure that in the future versions, if they ever take those things out, I will always have them in my image because I've made a custom image installing those. So if I just do a Docker image ls here, I don't have a cleaned up machine. So, oh, I do. Actually, I've only got a couple here. So if I do a Docker image pull of, let's just do the Ubuntu, and then let's do Debian, and then let's do Alpine. Because these numbers change all the time, I'm not actually sure what the most frequent numbers are, what the current status is. So let's do that Docker image ls again. And all right, so Alpine comes in at 5.5 meg. Pretty crazy, right? If you get into the whole reason behind that, it's actually pretty cool about how they build static binaries and stuff, linked binaries, so that those are really small. If you look at Ubuntu 3 years ago was probably 120 meg, 130 meg at least, and now it's down to 87, and the current version of Debian is 101, which is weird because you would normally think that Ubuntu is normally bigger than Debian. And I'm not sure that if that's changing in the next release of Debian. Someone in chat probably knows this answer faster than I do. But I think there might be a version, let's see, experimental maybe? Let's do experimental. Oh. I'm just going to guess that it's smaller. And remember, while we're doing this, that if you're thinking about your servers, well, I might have 100 containers running. Remember that, assuming they're all using the same base layer, that layer is only taking up one time on the operating system. As long as you keep your images clean by auto pruning them, and as long as you do things like making sure that most of your apps you're running are within 1 or 2 versions of the base images, so that you don't have all the versions on the server, then you're not going to take up a lot of space with this stuff, right? All right, let's look at experimental. It's actually bigger. That's a bummer. I seem to remember at some point last year reading about Ubuntu and Debian moving to something, and they have their own Slim. Slim is something a little bit different. It definitely keeps a lot more out of there. But you might wonder how these things are getting smaller, and it's not because they're zipping them up or compressing them anymore. It's that they're actually just pulling out tools that aren't essential, or pulling out libraries that are no longer needed for those core tools. And that's why things like PS and ping and curl and other utilities are disappearing from these images. So just be wary of that. All right, so I think it's a great discussion, and I look forward to hearing your comments and reading your comments about this. And I'm actually planning on updates to a couple of my courses to talk about this and give a little bit more information on Alpine and when and why you may want to choose it over a different version of a base image, because it is a good discussion, and there's obviously lots to talk about, lots of different reasons for choosing a base image over another one. But yeah, so all right, now I'm going to be getting to the questions, and we're going to rapid fire through these. I'm going to basically answer as many as I can. I can't promise I have the best or even correct answers to all the questions. So if you will just be patient with me for a second, I'm going to scroll up and make sure that I'm getting all the original questions there. Biker was up first, who's a regular to the show. Hello, Biker. Biker 2010. And he's talking about my DockerCon talk, that I actually had a couple of demo fails in the last year in my DockerCon talks, and so I survived by rescuing my servers in real time, which is always fun, right? No pressure. You're on the stage in front of hundreds or even possibly thousands of people, and you have a fail. It's always fun to see if you can rescue from that. I like actually seeing other people fail, not because I want them to fail, but because often you learn more in their ability to recover a demo and what they need to troubleshoot to fix that demo. Sometimes that's some of the real nuggets you get in a presentation. So I can imagine where we would come up with a way to do presentations where we randomly make each other's demos fail so that we can learn from their recovery. That might be an interesting sort of demo hack, is to someone's going to break my servers and I'm going to have to figure out how to troubleshoot them live on stage. That might be an interesting talk for somebody if they want to submit that to a CFP. All right, Brandon's in with the next question here. Gosu versus user. How do you prefer to go about using non-root users in containers and keep file permissions on the Docker host sane? What's the current best practice? So permissions in Docker, not for necessarily Docker itself, but for the files you're running in a container, can be very frustrating, especially if you're using bind mounts. So bind mounts combine the permissions of the host files with those things running in the container, and that can often lead to you pulling your hair out and going a little insane. And some of my hardest projects have been when we needed multi-server shared file storage for multiple containers on different hosts, all accessing the same files with the right permissions, and also using least privilege with non-admin users, non-root users, right? So those can be really tricky. I would say user versus Gosu. So when you ask me about user, Brandon, I'm assuming you're talking about in the Docker image building, because that's where users applied, right? And Gosu tends to work better than sudo inside of building a Docker image. So that's my understanding, at least, of why Gosu is often used inside of Docker images for building. And I don't actually know the reason why. I probably learned it at some point years ago and then quickly forgot it. So I'm assuming what your question is really talking about is when you're building images. And I would say the user is the best practice there for using Docker file lines. And if you're inside a run command and you need to change permissions on a specific part of that run command, then that's where Gosu to me makes sense, because you maybe need to do things as root user, but not always inside that run command. So maybe that's when you're choosing to go Gosu and other things, right? So I think that largely what ends up happening with people with permissions is not the files in the image, it's the files during runtime, right? So once your container starts up, let's say you've got a node app and that node app is running as user node, and it has a user upload directory. And then those files are stored on the host. And so they're going to be stored as the user node, and because that's what node's is running at. And then you have some other process, maybe in a different container, and it's using a shared volume or something, or a bind mount. And that is not running as the same user and needs to access those files read-write. And you get into these problems around permissions. So I would say that at the end of the day, if you can't solve these problems with chown and chmod, then, like in other words, inside the Docker file, if you're doing, for example, a copy command inside of a Docker file, you can now do a chown on that, so that when you're copying files in, they copy with the right users that are given permissions to those files. You can't do a chmod, I don't think, yet, although that may be a feature. That's actually something I can look up. I'm not sure if that has been added. Let's see, Docker file. So if we go to the official documentation on that, right? Let me zoom in. And if I go to, so if I search chmod, I don't see anything. But if I go to chown, you can see where if you use the add or the copy, you can copy those in with the right permissions. That's a huge thing that happened a year or two ago that saves us a lot of space, because we then don't have to change the permissions on the file. So that's step one. Step two is if you need to change permissions of directories at runtime, like you need to have a volume set to certain permissions, that's what an entry point script is for. So if you were to look at an example, like if we just go back over here to Docker Hub, and I were to go into MySQL, and if you went into one of the MySQL Docker files, you would probably find that there's an entry point script, especially with things like databases. And an entry point script is something that will start every time a container is started. And often in these entry point scripts, you will see things like, I need you to chown everything in this directory and chmod it, or do a plus write global or something, which is not always the most secure thing to do. But if you need to change permissions on the fly, then you would do that inside this script. Now, of course, the problem in this script is that it's running as the user, I believe so, as it's running as the user that you've set in a Docker file. So that becomes another problem, because if you need to change permissions on files to make them readable and writable by the node user, but the script is running as the node user, then you have problems because you can't go to root essentially at that point. So I would say that there is no easy or best fix for that, but permissions is something you could probably write a whole course section on, right? A whole multi-hour training session on the various ways that permissions are dealt with. One little tidbit there, the last thing I'll say, because I know that I'm kind of going on your question, but it is something that I think comes up a lot, is that file permissions in Linux are just numbers. In fact, this was actually a tip that was given to me, I think, by Phil Estes, who's someone who implemented the namespace, the user namespace issues, or I'm sorry, the user namespace feature inside of Docker, which is not enabled by default. But if you wanted to have all your containers run as non-root, you would enable that. And he was one of the ones that helped add that feature. And we were talking one day, and he pointed out that, the user ID and the group ID are just IDs. You can set that number to whatever you want. They're just numbers. And so if you need files on the host, for example, to match those in the container, if you just set everything by ID number, then usernames are at that point really irrelevant. It's really the IDs that it's going to look at for matching those permissions. So in a case where I was working on a project and we needed to share files across multiple containers, but they were all running as different users, and we needed to make sure that the permissions matched up, we really just manually made sure those files were using the right numbers or IDs for the owner and the group, and then everything started to work. Because it didn't really matter that we didn't have the user created on the host, for example, that was matching that ID inside the container. We just made sure the ID numbers matched up. So that's a little tip. It took me a while to figure that out and to understand how those worked. But really just at the end of the day, it's doing number comparison to make sure that the numbers of the reads and writes and permissions match what the user that's executing the command is doing. So good question. I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's not something that we've had discussed here recently, and we should talk about it more. Biker's back with, I have a project that wants to host 6 to 10 very, very lightweight, 6 to 10 very, very lightweight websites. I could make a container for each, but could also edit Apache config to multi-host out of one container. The trade-offs. All right, so this is a great question, Biker 2010. What you're asking is, Apache servers, because we've had Apache for decades and decades, Apache web servers have the ability to run many websites all in one daemon, right? So one Apache HTTPD could run many different websites that are unrelated. And should you do that versus many containers? So maybe one website per container, or one large container image that has all the websites. My preference, if I'm running containers, especially if I'm running a orchestrator like Swarm or Kubernetes, is always more containers. The reason is that Apache obviously has that capability, but that capability was built into Apache decades ago, way before we had containers and isolation. And if I can isolate my websites into different containers, now in theory, that means we are running more Apache daemons, and that's a little less efficient if you're really focused on very small servers with very little resource utilization. So if you think about, if you had 10 websites and they were all running an Apache daemon in a different container, then obviously you've got a lot more executables running. That's taking more RAM and potentially a little bit of wasted resources. But if you're talking 6 to 10, you're not going to really gain anything. If you were saying, I need to run 1,000 websites and you have full control over all of them, then you would have more significant resource savings by putting those all in one container as one Apache, and then essentially using different Apache configs for each website, right? Now that's to me, that's old school. That's pre-container. I almost always would prefer isolating them in their own containers, because that's easier to me. I usually will have one repo, right, for the code for that website, and I'm going to put that repo into one container image, and there's that one-to-one relationship. That makes sense to me. You can also then scale those containers independently. So if one needs to have 3 containers running for performance reasons or redundancy, you can scale that one independently of other containers and other websites. Another reason, if you need to update a website, if you were doing the all-in-one container, that means now every web server has to restart just so that you can update that one container image. Whereas if each one had its own container image and its own container, then only the one that's changing would update, right? So you would break potentially less, you'd have less change overall. So anyway, that's just some of the good reasons to isolate. And the same reason goes for a lot of other things like MySQL, Redis, stuff like that. Some people want to, put everything on one huge SQL server, and that's fine. That might make sense for you, but there are also advantages to the isolation and the potential for updating and stuff like that of breaking these things out. So I think it's a little bit more fuzzy and not so black and white for databases because there is a lot of efficiency when you talk about memory savings and stuff, when you talk about building large SQL servers. But when it comes to applications like web servers, I always isolate them. All right, let's jump into some more questions. What do we got here? Hound says, damn, those dogs are cute. Well, thank you. Those are my dogs, past and present. And hopefully I'll have some more videos for the beginning of this live session, right? I'll maybe have some, I guess a whole bunch of videos. I'm going to throw some more in there and change it up a little bit here in a little bit. So Biker's back. Of course, basic principles is to keep one function per container, but if the function is Apache. Yeah, so I agree, Biker. Obviously you could, but yeah, isolate. I say isolate them. Unless you have a really good reason to not isolate them in their own containers, I would say definitely isolate. Arshad, hello. What is the best way to update configs in Docker Swarm? At the moment, I remove the stack and redeploy it. I am hoping there is a better way. There are much better ways. Definitely, you do not need to remove the stack because that would break everything, right? So what you can do now is you can essentially change the name in your stack files, and there's several ways to do it. But if you go, let's go look at the compose file format. Because if you're using a stack, you're going to be using a compose file to build that stack, right? And if we look in here at config, let's see if I can, configs. So under configs, one of the newer options is, let's see, are we on version 3? Yeah. Oh, you know what? We're in the wrong part of the file. This is in the service. So when you go down, here we go. Okay, this is what I'm looking for. If you go down and you change where you're defining your configs and secrets at the very bottom of your file, there's a newer attribute here called name. And what that can allow you to do is essentially, let's say you have one config and you actually are using it in multiple services, right? So you've got those services and you've got the definition in each service, right, where you're mapping the config into a file inside of the service, right? And you have the name in there. So what happens is if you've already created a config in Swarm through a stack file, and then you change that config file on your deployment machine, so maybe it's, let's say it's an Apache config, right, because we were talking about that. And then you dump it into your config file, you change that, and then you try to do a stack update. The stack will correctly look at the file, realize that Apache config file has changed, and try to recreate the config inside of Swarm, but it will then fail saying, I can't do this because the file already exists in Swarm. The Swarm already has this config, and it will prevent you from updating. The way that you fix that is you simply change the name here, and that way you only need to change the file, the actual Swarm file. So, I mean, not Swarm file, the compose file. And I'm trying to think if I have a good example of this where I can show you. I might actually be able to show you in dogs versus cats. So if you go to my dog versus cat repo, that I'm going to put that into the chat. HTTPS. Oops, no, it's just HTTP. Dog versus cat. This is a place where I have some stack file demos. And let's see, I'm going to look at one real quick for, let's look at this one. Okay, so you see down here at the bottom down here where I have the secret name. And I have the actual object name here, which is DB password. And that is referred to up here at the top inside of here. It's also referred to in this service up at the top somewhere. Actually, I don't have it in here. I should have it up there in the top there. It should be referred to multiple times, so it's a bad example. But the point is that what I can do is I can simply go down here and just add an incremental number here. And then the rest of the file will work. It will update properly. You can do a Docker stack deploy, and it will all work. And if you're thinking, I have to edit my config files, my compose files every single time, no, you don't have to. Another thing you can do is use an environment variable here, and then set that environment variable before you run the stack deploy. So maybe you have an environment variable that automatically is the date or something, and you can sort of look at this. I think I've actually seen people that write a script that will set an environment variable, and it'll intelligently change it based on the file date of the config file or the secret file. And it'll go look at those, see if they've changed. It'll do essentially a diff on them. And then if they haven't changed, it won't update it here, right? Because you only want to update them in the stack if they've actually truly changed. And I don't have that script handy, at least I don't think. I might have thrown it in here. Oh, there we go, hash config secret. Look at that. So if you jump into there, this is, I didn't actually invent this. Someone else showed me a good example. And you could run this command, this shell script, which would set a value, and that would be used by your stack file. So you'd always need to make sure you'd run this before you do a Docker stack deploy. But essentially what this does is across many different stack files, it will set an environment variable so that if I do a bunch of stack updates, it will intelligently decide when to update that config. So I hope that makes sense. That gets you a little bit farther. The short answer here is just go change that name attribute, which is optional down at the very bottom of your compose file. And that should do it for you. You won't have to change your stack by deleting it, which is a lot of work, right? That you wouldn't want to do that in production. Okay, moving on. These are some really great questions today. In fact, these are all questions that deserve their own video. So hopefully I will make videos of those one day. Let's see. Is that Warp? W-O-R-P? I think that's your name. Warp? Or, yeah. We have a service running on a subnet 10.0.2.0. From time to time, containers of this service cannot reach the outside world, internet, and other services cannot reach the containers. As soon as I change the subnet to basically anything else, everything works fine. Ideas. As soon as we change the subnet. So you're changing the subnet inside of a Swarm service, I'm assuming, because you say containers of a service. And so my assumption there is that you've got something on your physical network in terms of routing that is potentially impacting the different subnets in the 10 range. So you're doing a 24 subnet, so you're doing a class C subnet on the 10.0.2 network. So in that case, there's nothing obvious off the top of my head as to why subnets don't work and sometimes do work in Docker Swarm. The first thing I'm going to say is that could be a bug, but I've not seen it because it's intermittent. And anytime anything's intermittent, I always assume it's somehow related to a bug. So I would say that it's possible that on your Swarm that maybe some other container network is using that, but that would imply that your Swarm is somehow out of sync because Swarm is designed to ensure that overlay networks never use the same subnets. So I would maybe look at all the different subnets you have going on inside your Docker networks to make sure there's no potential overlapping there. I would also, anytime I have this problem, I would test from the host. I would jump on the host and I would do trace routes out of my network to the internet to test if there's what we call a black hole. And a black hole in a network is essentially where if I've got a certain IP address and I'm trying to reach some other IP address, my packets reach part of the way, but they don't get all the way. So then what I usually have to do there is you have to go through and identify all the different hops in your network, your default gateway, your internet gateway, all the places in between. And this really becomes an exercise in IP troubleshooting. So you definitely need to know TCP IP well and understand how routing works, how subnets work. But I don't think anything out of the box with Docker that I'm aware of would suddenly cause these things to fail and not work. So hopefully that gives you some troubleshooting steps. There is a whole toolkit of tools you could probably use to troubleshoot your network that one of the Docker engineers creates. It's called NetShoot. And you can get it here on GitHub. It's a really great package of Linux utilities and container utilities for troubleshooting over distributed networks and container orchestrators like Swarm and Kubernetes. So it started out just being a Docker tool, and now it's actually used more specifically for orchestrators like Swarm and Kubernetes. So check that out. And I'm a fan of that. I actually use it myself. So hopefully that'll help you. All right, moving on. Rashad says, I might investigate that approach at the moment everything is defined in a Docker Compose file. I think you're actually responding to Biker. Suna is on the call. So we have Docker Captain Suna Keller giving advice. You can set the name key inside each config or secret in the top level section. So he actually already answered my question, but I'm glad I answered it for the video audience. And I'm glad we both actually agree that that's the method to fix that. And if you add a variable like this in your CI job number or just a random value in between stack deploys, it'll work. So yeah, that name value showed up, I think last year as a new option inside of Compose files, and that really helped us. It didn't solve the complete problem, because ideally it should just work. Like stack deploy should just figure that all out for you, but it's a good way to get a workaround, at least for now. And Jorn's up, it says, do you have any recommendations when running Docker Swarm across multiple data centers? What's the maximum latency a Swarm can handle? That's a great question, and I don't see anyone answering it. Let me look at yeah, I don't see anyone really answering that. But the question is Swarm specific to a data center, or what's the limitations on network latency and boundaries? So if you go back to my Docker resources on brettfisher.com/Docker and scroll down to my videos and conference talks, in fact, I have referenced things already today multiple times that are answered inside of my last 2 years of DockerCon talks. Part 1 talks about the decisions you need to make going in production with Swarm, including things like Swarm design and data center design and regions and firewalls and all that sort of stuff. Part 2 goes into using my dog versus cat repo and how you might build out all the production tools you need for a bunch of servers running Swarm. So I would say look at part 1, but the short answer to that is we say 10 milliseconds. So technically a Swarm can operate globally. Technically, the features are there, it functions, but it will not perform well when it comes to making decisions. Because if you think about a Swarm, it's having to constantly make decisions about where work should go, how it should deploy containers, how it should health check and update containers. And if you're doing that over highly latent networks, like satellites or regions of the world, that's going to suffer. That performance will suffer. It doesn't mean that your containers will run slow. It just means that the Swarm itself will be much slower in making decisions. For example, when your container starts to go bad and the health check stops working, it's got to decide if it's going to kill that container and then build a new one. And that work will take much, much longer, potentially even minutes longer if you've got highly latent links. So we all say 10 milliseconds. I think that's the official Docker recommendation. What I tell people is just a Swarm is designed to run in one geographic area. So in AWS terms, we would say it's designed to run in one region, and you can have parts of your Swarm in different failover availability zones because those are all very fast, right? They have really high speed connections. They're lower than 10 milliseconds usually. So you can run different parts in those different data centers, but those data centers in a AWS region are all geographically close to each other, usually in the same city, so that they're very fast. So if you need multiple regions for region, maybe you need something closer to the customer, or you need to do region-based high availability, where just in case an entire region of a country goes down for some reason, then what I would recommend is you do multiple swarms, and then you, at a higher level, use tools such as Portainer, or Docker Enterprise has a tool, they demoed it last year, it's not released yet, but they have a tool coming for Docker Enterprise that allows you to manage many different swarms and Kubernetes clusters across different regions and data centers. And so if you think of it in terms of your stack of stuff, you have your servers, and then you have a swarm, and that swarm can be in many different racks or of a data center, or multiple data centers. But then when you need to escape that region, you need a higher level tool on top of that that will manage your deployments to different regions. Hopefully that helps get you started, but I do talk about that in my DockerCon talk on the website. All right. So Josh, hello Josh. Josh is talking, I tried to use Alpine for smaller images, but ran into compatibility and other issues, so I stopped using Alpine images. Yes, and I have had other people tell me that as well, especially, I just know that there's one particular issue with NodeMon and Node.js tends to bite a lot of people. And then, and it has something to do with the file syncing support. I'm not really sure. But yeah, that's not the first time I've heard that about Alpine and compatibility. Sometimes the dependencies you need for your app, even in Node, aren't available on Alpine, because it doesn't have every dependency and every build of everything on the internet. So that can be a limiting factor. Yeah, and now that the Ubuntu image is getting below 100 meg, like probably a lot of us started with our apps. If our apps are more than a couple years old, we all started with other base operating systems where we're using apt or yum package managers. So why not keep using those with their base images? All right. Zorol, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I am a SQL DBA, and is it okay to learn Docker, AWS DevOps? Absolutely. I think that if you're not using SQL inside of containers today, you will be sometime soon. We are all migrating our different data infrastructures into containers. I think SQL, and people can argue, and there's lots of debates online around whether databases, persistent data, belong in containers. It is a hard problem that wasn't one of the first problems that Docker solved, but once we got volume support and vendors started to update their storage systems with Docker support, NetApp and IBM and EMC and Docker and Dell and all these other companies that make HP storage, all that stuff, they all have drivers now for Docker. So I would say that if you're not already doing it today, you probably will sometime soon. So definitely check out Docker, and you can get all my course links on this page that you're looking at here. So Docker Mastery, we talk about storage a little bit. I don't get into the depths of storage. It is definitely something that I would love to cover more in one of my courses about volume drivers, storage drivers, and that sort of stuff someday. All right, who's next? Yeah. Warp is saying, create your configs and secrets outside of your Docker Compose and reference them with external true inside the Compose file. Then you can control them individually. That is true, but that doesn't actually solve the problem. So I don't recommend that people actually do that. It is certainly an option, but you still would have to then update with a new secret or a new config, and then you would have to change the Compose file and then redeploy the stack file. So that's almost an extra step versus using the name attribute. And you maybe just didn't know about it, and that's fine. The name attribute is relatively new, but that is one of the reasons it exists. The other reason I like to use it is if I want to use something for a specific purpose. For example, in my dog versus cat repo, the name attribute now exists for networks. And so what I do is when I have a network that I want my swarm stacks to create, and I want that network to be a specific name so that all other stacks can use it. So it's got sort of a dependency on other stacks, stacks on stacks on stacks. I use the name. So for example, right here, I'm creating a network for my proxy traffic inside of a stack, but instead of it naming that stack, because that network would end up with having the name of whatever my stack name is plus the name here in the stack file. But I want a very hard-coded name so that all of my other stacks can depend on that name. And the way you do that also is to use this name attribute. This object here will then allow, what will happen is the stack won't use the default naming. It will use this specific name when creating the network, just like it would do that for secrets and configs. And then anytime I need to use it in the future, it will have, that name will be set, and I'll know exactly what that name needs to be. And I won't have to go and then research, well, what did I call that stack? Because that's what all objects are called in a stack normally by default, is the stack name first. And that could be anything, right? It could be whatever you called the stack when you created it. So most people didn't realize that when it came out, or what its use was for that, but it's a really nice way to do that. Rashad, you're saying, but how do the containers get restarted? Would you have to manually restart them? I'm not sure, sorry, what you're in reference to. When I'm talking to the camera, I'm not able to follow the live chat. So unfortunately, it's hard for us to have a one-on-one conversation. If you, by the way, have more questions and you want to have a conversation about it, either put it in the comments of YouTube here, or feel free to ping me on Twitter. I'm at Brett Fisher on Twitter, and we can have a chat about it. If you're in my Docker Mastery Slack chat, you can always go reach me there. And I check that every couple of days. So happy to talk more. Let's see. Oh, I see we're all still discussing the stacks and configs. Looks like I hit a good topic, stacks and configs there. Yeah. Suna's talking about the main thing that is configs can't be mutated, but services can be updated with new specifications. You cannot remove a config that's being used, but you can create a new one and refer to that. Yes. That's basically the way that Docker expects us to use secrets and configs, is to create new ones and then refer to those. And when the configs and secrets, by the way, first came out, I was also confused, and I thought that I had to change the name of the file inside of my app, and that's not true either, because whenever you take a config or a secret and you map it into that service, you can always change the name of whatever it's going to be inside the container. You can call it whatever you want. That way, that is always hard-coded and predictable, and the only thing you ever need to change is the name attribute on the config itself. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, that's good. That's good stuff. Good conversation. All right. I'm going to move on from that. Thanks, everyone, for talking about that. All right, we have Miroslav. Hopefully I got close to pronunciation on that. I'm having problems using RexRay plugin and Swarm running on Azure. Any advice on how to debug? Where can I find logs to see what went wrong? I'm using stack files from Cats vs. Dogs repo. Well, I'm having problems using RexRay, so that's a pretty vague. I guess what you're asking me is, how do you troubleshoot RexRay? And I'm sure that I'm not going to know this off the top of my head. I know that I've done this, but it's got to be. Okay, so without looking at the documentation, because there is RexRay documentation on logs, I'm going to say, I'm going to look at the daemon logs. So the daemon logs for Docker. And I'm going to look at, first I'm going to work my way down the list. So the first step is, are you even seeing that volume in the container? So can you just jump in the container and look to see if the volume is actually mapped in and exists? I've had cases where the volume can't be created. So that is basically the stack trying to, or the service in this case, trying to create a volume before it creates the container, and that volume can't get created for some permissions. RexRay doesn't have the right permissions. RexRay has a name conflict, and a lot of these things all show up in the task. And this is something that I walked someone through the other day, and I don't think they realized that this existed. So if I'm looking at a stack, so let me just do. If I'm using a stack right here, let me see if I can deploy one real quick. Just going to make one up. Let's see. Let's do stack. Actually, no. Let's do this. Let's do this. Example. I'm just going to do the example voting app, just so that I have something to work with. I think this should work. All right, so this will take a second because this is on my local machine. But what I'm doing is I'm creating a stack of a bunch of apps, and a couple of them have volumes. And so I'm doing a watch. A watch is a Linux command for rerunning a command over and over every 2 seconds by default. And so I'm watching for these things to come up. Now, another thing I can also do is do a Docker events. And this will give me a live running set of swarm actions that are taking place. And what people don't realize sometimes is that you can inspect the task. And it's not obvious how to do it, but the task often gives you the problems with why a container can't be recreated. And this is probably something I should do in a video, but I will show you really quick that on here, you'll notice how I have all these replicas here, right? So I have replicas 1 for 1. So now, right now, you know that this thing has at least created them. So if I do a Docker service ls again, I see all these services. Now, what if I want to see the specifics about the container and basically swarm right in the container? Because if you know swarm, you know that a stack creates services, services create tasks, tasks create containers. You learn all this if you take my swarm mastery course. And in there, we essentially have layers of abstraction. And what a lot of the problems happen when you see something like this, where you see a 0/2, meaning I can't deploy these containers because there's a problem. A lot of times that might be Rexray, or it might be networking or something like that. And often what I will see the error of that, I won't see it in the service because the service has many tasks. And so those errors don't roll up. It also may not be in Docker logs because Docker logs only work once the app is started because it's the app logs. So there's this middle ground. The problem there is you don't necessarily see those. And the way that I can see that error is I do a Docker service PS, and let's do that on Brett Fisher. Let's just do it on Redis. How about this? We'll just do it on the Redis one. Test Redis. Okay. When I do a Docker service PS, I get the list of tasks, and that ID over there, notice how this ID is different than the Redis ID up here, because this is a list of services, and the service ID, when I do a Docker service PS, I'm getting the task ID. The task ID is different than the container ID. The container is what's running on the Docker engine. If I actually did a Docker PS, the actual Redis instance, yeah. So see that's the container ID. That is not the same thing as my task ID. So what if I take that task ID and I do a Docker inspect and then I copy that ID in? Well, the answer there is I get back the task information. It's different than the service and it's different than the container itself. And what will happen in here is if there's any error, it will show up here inside of this YAML. And you can actually, JSON, sorry, this is in JSON. But I will see errors in there, such as Redis can't create whatever. And I had this problem recently on DigitalOcean because it was trying to create object storage with the same name as existing object storage, and it can't do that. In a single region, you can only have a DigitalOcean block storage with the same object name. And so Redis kept failing, and the error was right here in my Docker the whole time, but I wasn't seeing it at the container, and I wasn't seeing it at the service. I had to look at the task. And so that's a pro tip, Docker inspect the task name, and you might see the errors. And so what I usually do is I drill down. I do a Docker inspect the service, then I do a Docker inspect of the tasks that are having the problems, and then I might do a Docker inspect the actual, if I have to, the actual container itself. I might do a Docker logs on that container itself before I go to something else like daemon logs. And daemon logs would be going to the machine that it's on and typing, journal D or journal CTL commands to look at the actual logs of the Docker daemon, which don't always tell you much about the containers and what they're doing. But if a plugin has problems, the plugin in Docker may expose itself as a Docker daemon log. Anyway, that's a really long explanation, and I went a little long on that one, but I felt that maybe that's a good tidbit for today. All right, so we're running a little long. I'm going to pick a couple more questions and answer them, and if you didn't get your question answered, don't worry. Stick around, leave the browser open, and I will answer any of those and have the chat with you, live chat, after we end the live video. So let's see. That was a great question, though. Thank you about the Rexray. What management tools do you recommend to keep track of totally unrelated Docker environments running in different locations, partly at customer sites or even virtual servers and data centers? So Stefan, I don't have a single tool that I would do that on, but yes, Portainer would be one of those tools, would be probably the only tool that I know of for Swarm, if we're talking Swarm, or Docker Engine itself. In other words, if you're just using a bunch of Docker servers with no orchestrations, Portainer works there as well. Portainer allows you to have multiple swarms and multiple containers multiple swarms and multiple engines that are all unrelated, as long as the right ports are open or you have VPN between them. I'll be honest though, I have not seen this setup. I have not seen someone do this. So if you do it, ping me on Slack or in Twitter or however you want, and let me know. You know, my email address is posted just about everywhere. It's on my website. So send me a note on whether that worked for you, and if it does work, did you have permissions problems? Did you have security concerns around the ports, because you do have to open up ports? There is an agent now that you can put on Portainer, and it's I love that tool. I recommend it all the time. It's one of the best free tools for Swarm, and those guys do a great job of developing it. And so, if you do use Portainer for your business, I recommend please give back to them. Like, give them a little donation. Maybe ask your company if you can spend a couple $100s just to donate to their fund, because they work really hard on that product and they get paid nothing for it. And it's primarily used by businesses to run servers. So it's a very small team. It's not like they have thousands or hundreds of people all working on it. So if you like Portainer and you want to see it stick around, I highly recommend you figure out a way to volunteer. Maybe just going into the issues on the Portainer website and contributing or helping answer questions. That's one way to give back. If those of you who don't know, Portainer is Portainer.io, and if you go under here, you can actually. I didn't know they had a forums nowadays, but looks like they have a new website. Very nice. I have not been to the website recently. But down at the bottom, you should be able to find the GitHub link, or just Google it and jump into their open source repos and give them a shout. And first of all, just telling someone that you love their stuff on Twitter is always a great way to thank people for using it. So, all right, I'm gonna answer two more questions, and then we're gonna have to wrap it up. Let's see. Oh, thanks, Hans. I did not know Alpine 3.9 switched back to OpenSSL. That's good to know. Let's see. Integrate security scanning in the Docker workflow. Alec asks, any resources on how to integrate security scanning into the Docker workflow? I would say first, look at that link, and then this article that I referenced all the way up in the top of the chat has some articles that it references that are from some other blog article. So go look in that. But the short answer is, how do you scan your images? Well, you can buy a product like Docker Enterprise, which does it automatically for you, or other products. But most people, what they do is you have to have a continuous integration, a CI/CD tool, right? So if you have Jenkins or CodeShip or whatever you're using, and inside of that workflow, after you build the image, but before you have deployed the image to your registry, right? You would build the image from your code, and then you would run a scanner, which all of them have a command line component. So you would just run the command line against that image, and it would scan that image. And then based on the results, maybe you're someone who says, if I have more than if I have any serious vulnerabilities from the CVE database, then I don't automatically publish this to my Docker repository for images, and I would send off an email alerting someone or send off a Slack message or something to alert them that there's vulnerabilities in this image, right? So normally you'd put that in an automated step. You would not run it manually. Of course, you can always run it manually locally by downloading the tools. One of them is all those tools mentioned in there, by the way, you can go look at their repos. One of the ones I do use is Aquascanner from Aqua Security. That's one of the ones mentioned in here. The microscanner is free, and there's other ones out there, and it's nice because you get a comparison a little bit there, but that's how you would do that. All right. Let's do one more good one that hasn't been asked recently. Anyone tips about IDs not having to exist on the host? Thanks for the thanks, Brandon. Let's see what else. Question just because. Okay, so because it was asked earlier, I'm going to answer this one, and then any of you that asked questions later on past this one, which is about 30 minutes ago, no, not 30 minutes ago. Yeah, about 30 minutes ago. I'll answer all those in chat. So the one asked here is talking about Docker in Docker and Docker outside of Docker, or DUDE. So Docker in Docker is essentially just what it sounds like. Sorry, one second. So my wife just called and said, hey, in a text, do you want a nitro coffee from Starbucks? Yes. If you're watching me, yes, I want a nitro coffee. Just look up hashtag Team Nitro on Twitter. There's a bunch of us that were big fans of Starbucks and nitro coffee. So if you ever want to thank me, buy me a nitro coffee on a Starbucks card. All right. Docker inside of Docker. Let's talk about this for a second. And this will be the last thing. Docker inside Docker is a lot of uses, and D-I-N-D. No. All right, we're just going to do hub. So there's two ways that people call Docker. People call Docker in Docker two different things. It's essentially two different things. I'm going to separate them out for you so you know. Docker in Docker can mean two different things. One of them is you essentially run the Docker executable, the client, right? Because we're talking about two sides of Docker. There's the client and the server. You're running the client in a container against some other engine somewhere else, right? And that happens all the time. Maybe you don't even have Docker installed in your local machine and you want to talk to a server, so you could technically run Docker on your local command line, right? So I could actually do Docker run, like let's say, this is a bad example, but let's say I want to run a specific version of the Docker client, and I don't have that because I have a newer version, right? If I do a Docker info, and Docker version, and I'm using the 1809.1 release, and if I wanted to use a different version of the client, which used to be a problem. Back in the day, we actually used to have to match exactly the client and server binaries, and so we would have to do something like Docker run it Docker sh, right? And so it would download. Now this is going to run the latest, which is going to be, it should be 1809.1 inside there. And so when I'm in there, then I can do a Docker version, and you'll notice that I can't talk to a server because the server is not running in the container, right? It's just the server binary is there, but it's not running, right? Because the only thing I did was run a shell. So I could do something like that and specify a version. So like, let's say 1703, which is a very old version of Docker. It's a couple years old. And so now when I do a Docker version, I get the 1703 version. So if I needed to run old versions of the client, this is one way to do it. Now that's technically one of the ways that some people call this Docker in Docker. Now I don't consider this Docker in Docker, the DIND as we often refer to on the internet. When I talk DIND or Docker in Docker, what I'm talking about is running the engine inside a container. So you've nested the engine inside of another engine, essentially, right? And what people often use this for is for running Jenkins or running CI/CD solutions, where you need to spin off a task or to do some sort of work, right? Like a job or a batch job. But in there, that task might need to be build my image, scan my image, upload it to the registry. All of those tasks require an engine to talk to. And that means you have to run the daemon inside of the container itself. In fact, if you've ever used Play with Docker, if you've ever used Play with Docker as a web GUI to give you actually an interface to the Play with Docker application, which is essentially Docker running in your browser, that is technically Docker in Docker. They are running Docker on a big physical server, and then inside there, each one of us gets a tiny little Docker engine running all on its own. And so that has uses mostly for CI/CD, for testing, for building things where you need to create isolated environments that then need to be able to control Docker. Now, the way you would do that is you would need to run this Docker image and then have it spin up the Docker binary, the daemon, in the background, and then also set some permissions and privileges so that it has, because by default it won't just run, it needs certain privileges and stuff on the host to be able to talk to the kernel. And those instructions you can find all over the web, right? Everybody talks about that. There's plenty of different examples of that. The demo here on the Docker node, I'm sorry, the Docker reference here might even refer to it. Not sure if, yeah. So this might even be the specific image that will default to, and I haven't checked it recently, so I didn't even know this one was available. This one might be the way that you would do that, and I'm not so sure. So to me, those two examples, though, have two different uses. Now, the other way I see Docker being used, and I would still consider this Docker in Docker, is that you're running the Docker client against a remote engine that happens to be on the host. And I show you an example of that. This is kind of like the third way. I know I have it somewhere in my dog versus cat. So I give an example here where I'm running the prune command in a swarm every day, right? And so this is me creating a Docker container that runs the Docker client against a Docker engine, and that engine looks like, it seems like to the container that it's inside that container. But what I've done is I have bind mounted the host engine into the container at container runtime. And then that means whenever I type the Docker command in the container, it's technically executing against the host's engine. So this isn't me running the Docker engine inside a container. This is me running just a client. But since I bind mounted it, I can run those Docker command lines, and they are technically running against the host. So it's almost like you're escaping the container and able to run Docker command lines on the host. And there's actually different ways that you do this. But in this example, I'm doing it as a simple example for how I would tell my Docker host in a swarm on an ongoing basis, in this case every day, how to do a Docker image prune to clean up all my images so that my servers don't fill up with Docker images. And of course, this is one of my favorite tips because people that have ever run Swarm, this is a problem that they always end up dealing with, is that their servers fill up with images over time. So go check that out. Hopefully that gave you, now I don't know what Docker outside of Docker is. Don't know what that is. I haven't actually looked that up. So I will have to go look that up and find out what you're talking about with Dude. I like that name, Docker outside of Docker. I'm not sure what that is, but hopefully that gives you some reference of the different reasons for the different Docker and Docker scenarios and why you might use those. So for the rest of you still on, thank you so much for watching. Please, again, check out my resources, brettfisher.com/Docker. Get on the list for the newsletter to sign up for my new Node.js course coupons that'll be coming out here in the next few weeks to months. And thank you so much for joining. I will be back here next Thursday for Docker Ask Me Anything and DevOps stuff. And don't forget to sign up to subscribe on this channel and click the bell so you get notifications when I go live next time. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.